Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Katie Smoller, and I'm the Director of Educational Programs here with the National History Academy. And we are so grateful for you joining us today as we continue our tour through different U.S. history sites across the country. And today we are fortunate enough to be joined with Park Ranger Diane from George Washington Carver National Monument. So Diane, thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome, Katie. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I am Diane, Park Ranger at George Washington Carver National Monument. We are located in southwestern Missouri, right on the corner, almost with Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. And so we're way on the western edge of settlement way back when Missouri became a state in 1821. We just finished celebrating the state's bicentennial, and you may know your history enough to know that Missouri came into the Union as under the Missouri Compromise, and that meant it was a slaveholding state. So slavery was illegal here, and that is a key aspect of George Washington Carver's life story. So I'm going to share today a few images about Mr. Carver, about the park here, just share information with you, and I look forward to answering your questions as you think about them. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and when I do that, I'm going to turn off my video so you don't have to look at me too much. Okay, and that'll help with our bandwidth issues. So there goes my video. And can you go ahead and see everything? That's my slideshow.
Everything looks good.
Great, fabulous. Okay, so, whoops, I'm so sorry. I guess I don't know how to do that. There we go. Okay, so you've seen that. And this is George Washington Carver, much later in life after he had achieved his national prominence, basically. And posing for the photographer here, you can see he's wearing his trademark, which is a flower pinned to his lapel of his suit coat. And this is because he really believed in showing God's handiwork and the beauty of nature, something that he collected every day from the time he was at least in college, if not earlier. But his life began here in Missouri. Not sure where you are located, but you can see we're almost in the middle of the U.S. And that was, like I said, a slave state established in 1821. Under the Missouri Compromise, slavery was illegal. Maine came into the Union at the same time as a free state. And the compromise was a way to obviously try to maintain the balance between free and slave states and to avoid war. What it actually did, in effect, was postpone the war over this issue of slavery, and it postponed it for 40 years. And it was 40 years later, approximately 45 years or so, that George Washington Carver was born here. And in 1855, Moses Carver, who was the landholder here on the land that is now a national park, received this, which is basically a bill of sale or a receipt. And if you can't read that, I'll just read it to you. Received of Moses Carver, $700 in full consideration for a Negro girl named Mary, age about 13 years, who I warrant to be sound in body and mind and a slave for life. Given under my hand and seal this 9th day of October, AD 1855, by William McGinnis. So that was signed and dated and sealed and all of that. Guys, you're looking at a legally binding document here. And it's dealing with property, treating Mary, this young teenage girl, much like a horse or a cow, sound body, sound mind. And you can see here that she was a slave for life. And this is the young girl who later grew up and became the mother of at least 2 boys. One was James, one was George. And both were born here enslaved during the Civil War, owned by Moses Carver. Now, George Washington Carver remembered the slave cabin. And later in life, he sketched it out, and you've got it right here, whether he used charcoal or pencil. You can see some characteristics of the little cabin. We believe it was 12 to 14 feet square. You can see it had a very simple chimney, and he's got the little doorway in the path. But you don't see any windows. It had to be a dark little place. And this is where Mary lived for approximately 10 years of her life. This is the place where little Jim or James was born. And during the Civil War, this is where George Washington Carver was born as well. We don't know exactly when he was born, but he says, quote, I was born near the close of the Great Civil War in a little one-room log shanty of Mr. Moses Carver. So this is the one-room log shanty where George was born, and these are his memories. He remembered this place. Now, it was also the location where the bushwhackers or the outlaw gangs came, and they actually abducted, stole, kidnapped, whatever you want to call it, but they captured Mary, this young mother who was probably in the neighborhood of 22 or 23 years old, and her newborn child, George, the one you know as George Washington Carver. Okay, so just stopping for a moment here, guys. Just want to stop and say that it was in this little log cabin that George remembered that all of these traumatic things happened to him. And as a result of this kidnapping or abduction by outlaws, George ended up, just to sum it up, he ended up orphaned. He ended up possibly left with a family along the road somewhere. He ended up with an illness that he called whooping cough, an illness that nearly killed him. And he ended up being rescued, you might say. Moses Carver, the white landowner and slaveholder, paid a man to go track down these outlaw gangs and bring Mary and George back. And the story that George was told is that Moses Carver offered a racehorse, which is a pretty expensive piece of property or equipment, to bring them back. And so when only George the baby was brought back without his mother, it appears that Moses Carver paid the full price. And George later said in life, quote, "I was ransomed for a racehorse." Now, he was way too young to remember his mother when all of this happened. He can't remember any of it. Of course, he was an infant, we believe, but he does think about it during his lifetime. And so you can only imagine the trauma he must have felt when he thought about what happened to his mother that day and what happened to her since then. He never saw her again. So he had an older brother, 4 to 5 years older than him, who was not kidnapped or abducted. And then, so there he is as an infant, unable to care for himself, this little toddler brother who's unable to care for himself. So you can probably figure it out that Moses and Susan Carver, who were the white people who lived here, then took Mary's boys into their own home and raised them. And so here we have one of the 2 photographs that we know of George Washington Carver as a child, basically. We believe in this photograph he was somewhere in the neighborhood of 10, 11, or 12 years old. We're not sure. But we do know that he is about to hit puberty here. He is almost a teenager, if not already. And we do know that it was about this age that he left home to go to school. Freedom came for this child while he was a baby, but of course he was too young to understand it. And by the time a decade of life had passed, George Washington Carver didn't understand, but he was going to find out very quickly that the schools and really society was segregated by race. So when he asked to go to school at the local one-room school, the people in the neighborhood said, "No, you cannot go to our school." And so that is what caused George to move away from home to the county seat, which is about 8 miles from the farm. There he knew of a school, okay? And that school is, let's see if I can use my pen here. This is the schoolhouse over here. In those days, they called it the Neosho Colored School. About 1872, the Black community of Neosho, Missouri established a school for their children, and they probably had previously, but the school district had not been educating the Black children. And so George had heard about the school and he went down there and he ended up living in this house next door, okay? So this is the house where a woman named Mariah and her husband Andrew lived, okay? And so George ended up having to leave home to go to school. He walked 8 miles to find a little one-room school and a teacher who had about a 3rd or 4th grade education. Here's Mariah Watkins. She's the one who lived in the house next door. Now, Mariah Watkins was much older by the time George got there. She was probably in her 50s or so. And she took this child in. He was an orphan, and she allowed him to live with her and her husband. While he lived there and went to school, she had chores for him to do. She gave him a Bible, and she took him to church. And she also told George that when he got finished with his education, that he needed to go out and share his education. So guys, I want you to know that you're looking at the woman who really made a difference in his life. George Washington Carver talks about the Watkins family, Mrs. Watkins and her husband, and said, quote, "They took me in just as family," unquote. So here he is, an orphan child living with Andrew and Mariah Watkins, who, as you can see, she is African American, as was he. And George went to school during the day, but she is the one who influenced him, or at least planted the seed up in his mind, to share his education. Now, if you know anything about George Washington Carver, you know that he did become an educator. Well, he moved off to Kansas. He left Neosho, Missouri, when he gained all the education that teacher could provide for him. And he ended up moving to Kansas, where, at first school was going well, but he didn't understand that racial segregation was being enforced with violence. So the violence basically came almost to his front door one day in Kansas, in Fort Scott, when he witnessed a lynching or a murder, racially motivated murder, of an African American man in town. And George tells about it in pretty graphic detail, and he ran away from that town. And that started him moving from town to town. Now he's an orphan. He is alone in the world. He has no money or property. And so what George needs to do is get a job. And so every place he worked, every place he moved, he found an odd job. But he also found nice people who would take him in and give him a place to stay. Some of them became mentors, like Mariah Watkins. He finished high school in Kansas, actually. And after he finished high school, he applied for college in Highland, Kansas, and unfortunately was turned away or rejected based on his race, based on their racism. He homesteaded out in western Kansas for a time. Okay, he did finish high school, but western Kansas and farming wasn't the ideal life for George. He thought there was something more in life, and he said he ended up in Iowa. So he took the train, went to Iowa, and that is where, times were very good. Iowa was very good for him. Here he is. See if you can find George. I'm sure you can in this photograph. So Iowa was a happy place and time for George Washington Carver. You can't say that about his years in Kansas. And Missouri, his years here were quite traumatic, but he did at least have a brother here. Kansas was very difficult. Now here he is in Iowa. And the town, this is Simpson College. And you can probably tell by looking, but this is the art class, and they're posing for the photographer. George obviously sitting down, looking away from the camera, and he totally intended to become an artist. So the man you know is George Washington Carver, maybe the educator, maybe you know him as the Peanut Man. He started his career believing he would go into art. Now his teacher, Miss Budd, encouraged him to consider other career fields, and her father was actually on staff at Iowa State College. So even though art was in him and going well, George changed colleges and changed his major. And that happens to a lot of us when we go to school. When we go to college, we start out thinking we're going to do one thing and we change our mind and do something else. And that's what he did. He changed his degree, he changed his school, he changed his mind, and he remembered what Mariah Watkins told him, to share his education. Well, how can you share your education if you don't have something other people want to learn? And so he went into agriculture, believing it was a good field, a line of work for him. And he ended up graduating in the year 1896 with a master's in agriculture. So he earned a bachelor and a master's degree at Iowa State College. which was the premier agricultural school of the time. He also was the first Black graduate from that university and was later hired to teach freshman level courses and do research and so on. So like I said, Iowa was very good. But there was a man named Booker T. Washington who had started a school in Alabama named Tuskegee Institute. And he was looking for the very best educators and faculty members for his school. He recruited George Washington Carver, and he was successful. So George Washington Carver began receiving these letters from Booker T. Washington. And the letters kind of went back and forth. George wasn't sure if he was going to do that because he was really happy in Iowa. Finally, he wrote a letter back to Booker T. Washington, and he said, in essence, quote, "It has always been the one great ideal of my life to be of the greatest good to the greatest number of my people possible. And to this end, I've been preparing myself all these years, believing as I do that this line of education is the key to unlock the golden door of freedom for our people." Well, that's a very long sentence, and you can sum it all up with the word yes. I will take the job. So he took the job, left Iowa behind after he graduated and finished his master's work, took with him a gift that the Iowa faculty and students gave him, which was a microscope, and he left Iowa on his way to Alabama. And he said this: "When I left the green cornfields of Iowa and headed south, I saw nothing but cotton. Everywhere cotton. The cotton was poor, the land was poor, and the people were poor." So ladies and gentlemen, the year is 1896. George has taken a train from Iowa to the southeast, to Alabama, way down south in Alabama. And he's seen nothing but cotton, and you can probably imagine he's working those cotton fields. But I want to share with you the term sharecropper. And these are people who don't own the land, they don't own the house, they don't own the horse or the mule or anything. They are in perpetual debt and they can't get out because they have to borrow money to pay rent on their land, to pay for the seed, to pay for the animals that they use, and so on. And so what it was, guys, is virtual slavery. So this system took over when slavery ended, this sharecropping. So the same families, the same generations of the same family would stay on the land that used to be plantation land, and they're still farming cotton. Now Carver has a master's degree in agriculture, so he knows scientific farming and how to care for the soil. But when he moved to Alabama, that's not what he found. He did not find scientific agriculture. All right, so I'm sharing with you now a photograph of George Washington Carver and the agriculture faculty. All of these men work at Tuskegee Institute, Alabama. You can pick Carver out. He's always the one with a plant on his buttonhole of his lapel. He's sitting in the middle on the bottom, and he is actually the director of agriculture. So these men are very busy getting the agriculture department going in Alabama. And although Carver himself thought he would only stay for a few years and then he'd go back to painting, this man remained at Tuskegee Institute for the rest of his life. It was an epic career. He believed that he was making a difference in the world and the people there needed him, and so he stayed. In fact, here he is many years later. Let's just go back and compare. Here he is. I can probably tell you he's wearing dentures here. He's got white hair. If you go back, you can find a young man full of promise. And by the time he got old, George Washington Carver was still a happy man, full of promise, full of purpose, and he lived his life in such a way that when he died in 1943, Congress decided to establish a national park to honor him, and this is it. George Washington Carver National Monument. I've got a few photos of the park to show you, and then I'll be glad to answer questions. As we head down the trail, we're going to come to the site right over in the corner. I'm going to kind of circle it for you if I can find my pen. Well, there it is. Okay, this is what you find at the bottom of the trail there. This is where the slave cabin once stood. Okay, and so this is just the foundation or the bottom of the walls. We, the National Park Service, built those. I can tell you the original log cabin is long gone. But guys, when you go over to this place and you stand on this ground, you know you are right where history happened. All these things we talked about, Mary being brought here as a 13-year-old, enslaved by Moses Carver, giving birth to 2 babies. There's a father somewhere. The abduction, the kidnappers, all of these things happened right there where you're looking. This is a statue of George Washington Carver. It's called the Boy Carver statue. He had a nickname as a child called the plant doctor. He's actually holding a plant. We have a lake where George would have actually experienced it as a creek when he was a child. Beautiful trails, lots of places to explore. George said that as a child, he had so many questions about the natural world and no one could answer him. And that's what propelled him out the door to go to school. This house was built in 1881. By 1881, George Washington Carver had long left Missouri and he was almost done with Kansas by 1881. A bad tornado had come through the farm in 1880, so Moses and Susan built a new house. And you can see it here. It's a 3-room farmhouse. Quite an improvement over a log cabin. George Washington Carver never lived here, but he did visit the Carver family here. But as a comparison to where George was living, I can tell you that he was living in Kansas, in the town of Minneapolis, Kansas, in a little area they called Poverty Gulch. So compare what your brain thinks about when you hear the words Poverty Gulch with this lovely house. George was poor. He was alone. He was orphaned. He was hardworking. He was determined. And despite all the challenges in his life, he did obtain his education. He wanted to paint. Here's a great photograph of our trail. And you can kind of see the Carver house in the background, and you can see George painting. We have a cemetery on the land. George and his descendants, or his family, excuse me, are not here. These are the White Carvers and their family. And we have beautiful tallgrass prairie here at the park. So, and there's the visitor center. And that was a really fast overview of George Washington Carver's life and what we have here at the park. We have some inside exhibits in our visitor center, and I'd be glad to show those to you as well. But I hope that you learned something about Mr. Carver, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Yeah, Diane, that was so great. Thank you so much for sharing. I didn't know all that was there too. That's great to know. Another one to add to the list to visit in person now that things are opening up again. But yes, we do have some questions. So our intern, Ben Keller-Hulse, is going to be helping us out with those.
Hi there. Great presentation. And likewise, that's awesome. I'm at university myself studying American and African American history, and Mr. Carver is an underrated figure. So with that, let's get into some questions. First of all, what would you say is the main takeaway you hope people have when visiting the monument?
Main takeaway would be what Mr. Carver had to overcome, the many obstacles in order to live a life of success and service to others.
Yeah, that's sort of great commitment he had to his own goals as a parent. Let's see. In the current, this is a good one. In the current climate of talking about history and especially things like Black history, how does the site deal with that, or how can the site deal with that? Do you ever have negative experience with certain people? Do people come with a lot of misconceptions? Have people never heard of him?
Right. Good question. Yes, we never shy away from those conversations. I think probably in my experience here, it's more unintentional racism, if you will. People don't understand that what they're saying maybe is a misconception of what life was like for George. I think we've come a long way in the National Park Service in the way that we interpret or share the story of African American history or any underrepresented audiences. So yeah, we have difficult people from time to time. Most of them have their conception of who Mr. Carver was, what his life was like, and they put him in a nice little safe box, So, but if you really want to understand him as best we can without really knowing him, you have to put him in the context of his times and what was going on. You may think, oh, look at all he did with his life, but have you thought about what he wasn't allowed to do with his life? What could he have done? I mean, this is a fantastic legacy he's left behind, but he had other things he wanted to do in life. And like all of us, you hit these roadblocks. And so I think that was a long way to answer your question, but I think when people come here and they view our film, and you can view that on our website, by the way, and check our website out, it's really excellent. Or if you want to go out on nps.gov/teachers and pull down some of our lesson plans about Mr. Carver, or come take a guided tour, enjoy our fantastic comprehensive museum. You're going to learn a lot more about the context of his times and help you understand him a little bit more.
Awesome. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, here's an interesting one. It would seem that the general perception of Mr. Carver might be a lot of things, because he's not a war hero, or he's not a president. He's not the typical sort of historical figure. What would you say is his greatest lasting impact?
Well, this will just be my opinion here. Yeah, you're right. He wasn't a civil rights marcher, right? He wasn't a huge well-known leader in those ways. George Washington Carver was a humanitarian. He cared deeply about the lives of his fellow African Americans, specifically, all people. He was a godly man, and he lived his life to serve other people. As far as working at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, his outreach for the first 20 years was to those sharecropping families who had been denied education. Racial segregation was being enforced with much violence. And so they needed him. And so I believe he was able to make a difference in their lives in such simple things as how to have better nutrition, better health, and save some money and buy your own land. And, basically what they call the Tuskegee ideal. George Washington Carver was a big ambassador for that. He went on to become obviously world famous for his work with the peanut. We didn't really touch on that. I kind of do that on purpose because everybody knows about the peanut. But why the peanut, right? Because it grows in poor soil. It's highly nutritious, and it was kind of poor man's food. And so it was something that was accessible. And on top of that, as a legume, it helps restore nitrogen to the soil. So, I don't know if that answered your question, but I believe, in my opinion, his greatest impact would be his outreach to just the standard of living in his humanitarian efforts.
Yeah, and those are such very deep impacts. Let's see.
If I can interrupt you, Ben.
Yeah.
I just had a guided tour a while ago, and I had a young man ask me some similar question. He wanted to know what legacy there is of George today, and did he mentor anyone? And he left all of his money behind at Tuskegee in the Carver for the Carver Foundation, and it established a scholarship fund for young people and for research at Tuskegee. He mentored some young white men through the Commission for Interracial Cooperation, the CIC, which was very active in the 1920s and 30s. to try to quell some of that racial violence that was going on. So Carver would go to the white YMCAs. We don't think about them as being segregated, but they were. And then many of these young men would think, maybe I don't want to be like my parents and my grandparents were when it comes to race relations. And he also mentored Austin Curtis, who went on to, take George's job after Mr. Carver passed away. And so there were lots of impacts of his life.
Yeah, and that's another kind of history that's not really touched on so much. Those are deep impacts, and they come from the education and they reflect back on it, of course. Let's see. I think we can combine sort of two of these questions here. One aspect being, have there been any archaeological digs at the site? And two being, how is the site maintained? You showed us a couple of the things around, whether it be buildings or a statue and information posts.
Great questions. Well, yes, short answer, yes. We have had archaeological surveys, and those probably are done every 3 to 5 years, and we focus in on specific areas. There are archaeologists within the National Park Service who travel from site to site to do this specialized work. Part of the goal of doing that is to locate where the original cabin once stood. We have a cemetery. We're trying to determine if there are other graves there. And also the big 1881 house that I showed you is actually sitting kind of in a field right now, but it was originally built closer up near the birthplace cabin. And so those sorts of things are being done on a regular basis, just to kind of remap the grounds and make sure we have it accurately done. As far as taking care of the place, if you could look outside right now, you would see all of the tall grass prairie here is black. We've just finished a prescription burn, and it's only been a week and a half. So the tall grass prairie, we're right on the edge of the Ozark Hills and the prairie of Oklahoma. So we're kind of at the border there. So we have a lot of tall grass prairie and woodlands here and creeks that run through the park. So we maintain it through a variety of helpers. The Heartland Network, which is the science inventory and monitoring arm of the National Park Service, helps us with things like our aquatic life, reptiles and amphibs, birds. We do bird surveys, and then of course our burns, which is a whole nother branch of the Park Service that helps us with those things. The staff here, we just, we do tons of work just to maintain the grounds and make it a comfortable, safe, clean place for the visitors. I hope that answered that question.
Oh yeah, definitely. Awesome. Well, that might be, make sure I'm not missing anything. That might be all the questions we have. So we'll end with this question. We always like to ask our great guides to take us on these awesome sites and can show everyone all these amazing things and all this information. How you got to your spot, how you got to this place where you can be an educator, and if you had any advice for anyone that might want to do something similar.
Thank you for that question. I was on a call earlier about the internship program through the Volunteers in Parks within the National Park Service. And I was just like, remembering how I got started, literally like just 2 hours ago. So I was in university pursuing just a bachelor's degree in education, social studies. And I said, I want to teach history. That's all I knew. I wanted to teach history, right? And I remember one of my professors kind of lecturing me and saying, teaching is its own profession. It doesn't really matter what topic, right? So I went to school to be a teacher, and I thought I was going to teach middle school and high school, American history, economics, all that fun stuff. But that is when I met the National Park Service. And I happened to have an advisor who said, you really should go to the career fair. The Park Service will be here this afternoon. So I went. I met them, and even though I attempted to be hired, I wasn't qualified. So they brought me in through an internship program called the Student Conservation Association. So if anyone's interested, look up thesca.org, thesca.org. Fabulous way to get into natural resource agencies. When I finished my internship, I was brought on under the Student Career Experience Program, which today has a slightly different name, but we have ways of bringing people on who are still in school or recent graduates of university. So that's how I got in, and it turned into a full-time job. And I am now what am I? Let's see, I do a lot of things here. I am education, interpretation, and volunteerism park ranger here. So it's been a fabulous career. I highly recommend it. And maybe we'll see a lot of people retire and there'll be a whole lot of jobs opening.
Diane, that's great. We really appreciate it. I was just laughing at that. I think so many fields are experiencing stuff like that right now. We truly appreciate your time and being with us today. And I'm very much looking forward to visiting this one day. Your passion was very evident throughout all of this, and it looks like just a really great site. And whenever we get into some of these, I'm just really appreciative. And our nation, we do preserve these sites, and we do make sure some of even maybe not as well-known people, but not as heard of in the history books, are preserved and have spots where we can go and learn more about it.
We go judge National History Day at our local university at the regional level. And as a judge, without fail, I look at them and I say, there's a national park for that, because they don't even think to go look. But we don't just talk about Mount Rushmore or the Yellowstone or any of those guys. We have so many wonderful, compelling stories within our nation that are told by the national parks, including our internment camps during World War II and our civil rights movements and all sorts of things. And so, yeah, definitely go check out nps.gov and just search around.
Oh, great. And we'll add the link to the chat. So for anyone who's wanting to check those out. And again, Diane, thank you so much for being with us. We truly appreciate your time. And thank you again. This was a wonderful presentation.
Welcome. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone. And thank you all at home for joining in. We'll be back here next week, and I hope to see you back. Have a wonderful rest of your day.